I recently finished Mercy Eliad's series on the history of religious ideas, and throughout the book I noticed a variety of Christian concepts that emerged in different cultures long before the biblical texts were written. As someone raised in Western culture, I feel like Christianity has too firm of a grip on what it means to be a religion. Allegedly unique concepts like substitutionary atonement, the Eucharist, a God incarnate, and original sin are not unique at all and actually show up in earlier religious traditions, just in slightly different forms. In some cases that we'll talk about today, these concepts are emerging thousands of years before the biblical authors began their writing. Many Christians believe that their religion stands head and shoulders above all other religions that exist, and I want this video to help combat that. Usually the claims of this uniqueness fall along the lines of this video.
Within Christianity, you have something that's inherently unique in that in all other systems of religiosity, it's some form of survival of the fittest, right? It's some form of do this and you're accepted, feel this and you're accepted, or think this and you're accepted. However, Christianity says you can't feel, do, or think enough. It's not survival of the fittest. It's not the most intelligent or the most spiritual. Instead, the fittest steps down and sacrifices himself for the survival of the weakest.
We'll get more into the psychology of why people want their religion to be very unique. And this isn't something that is seen in earlier religious traditions, something newer to the monotheistic ones. But for now, let's take a closer look at these claims of characteristics that make Christianity unique. Before we begin, please consider subscribing if you enjoy the video. It really helps a small channel out. So let's begin with one of Christianity's defining features, and that is a God incarnate. The idea that God came to earth in human form to truly understand the human experience and overcome its defining challenges is something Christians assume is unique to their religion, or that it at least began with the narrative of Christ. And this is not true. We see an echo of this concept of God incarnate in the Epic of Gilgamesh, written 2200 years before the New Testament and over 1,000 years before the Old Testament. This concept is presented through Gilgamesh himself, who is partly divine and partly human. We see throughout the narrative that Gilgamesh carries around both divine and earthly characteristics. The divine ones often include things like his intense intellect and his immense strength, and also size, physical stature. But he's also challenged by human concerns. Most importantly, throughout the narrative, is his fear of death. And this really is the most important aspect of the entire narrative, is Gilgamesh's confrontation with death and his striving for immortality. I want to emphasize that this is very similar to the purpose of Christ's incarnation, to overcome death. Now, obviously, both gods go about solving this in completely unique ways, but the important thing I want to emphasize is that they are both earthly and divine, and the purpose of that is to experience what it is to be like a human. An important and supposedly unique element of the Christian narrative is that Christ has died on the sins as a substitutionary atonement for original sin. But as we'll see, neither of these concepts, substitutionary atonement nor original sin, are completely unique. We're here again considering Sumerian mythology, specifically their creation narrative, where humanity is created from the sacrifice of two guardian gods and the demonic god named Kingu, who was created by the goddess Tiamat. An interesting detail is that Kingu was originally a good, benevolent god, but he experienced this fall from glory or fall from grace, similar to what we see in the biblical story with Lucifer. Anyway, it was his blood that was utilized partially to create humanity. Eliad argues that this detail is added to emphasize that man was condemned by his own origin, that a fugitive, sinful element is inherent in what it means to be a human. Again, this doctrine is nearly identical to the concept of original sin. What's more fascinating is that this concept of original sin was dealt with the exact same way in Sumerian mythology and Akkadian culture that it was in biblical mythology. In the Akkadian religion, which can be seen as a continuation of the Sumerian mythology, sins were dealt with in a few different ways. First was via confession, and oftentimes they would read confessions that sounded something like this: "O Lord, whom I do not know, great are my sins, remove my transgressions." When I first read this, it sounded very biblical in nature, and it's because the biblical authors were most likely inspired by the Sumerian and Akkadian ones. I do want to mention this specific prayer or confession predates the biblical narrative by over 1,000 years. Another way that the Assyrians would deal with original sin was through substitutionary atonement. Christians often mention the crucifixion of Christ as this unbelievable event, and they're completely right in doing so. It's a massive and just unbelievable expression of bravery and selflessness. What many Christians don't realize is that this expression of selflessness and bravery is also seen in other cultures, specifically in the form of substitutionary atonement. In this culture, priests and even sometimes kings would be sacrificed on behalf of their congregation in order to literally die for the sins of their people. It is for this reason that many of these priests and kings developed the name shepherd. They were the shepherds of their congregation, willing to do anything it took to preserve the lives, both literal and spiritual lives, of their people. Surely the death and resurrection of Christ is unique, at least in the way that it's remembered through the Eucharist. Or maybe not. In Catholicism, the Eucharist and transubstantiation are the beliefs that the bread and wine of communion are truly the flesh and blood of Christ, and when consumed, it provides spiritual nourishment. And some passages in the Bible even suggest that there is no salvation without the consumption of the bread and the wine of Christ. This is actually a very archaic belief, probably the most archaic belief that we'll talk about on this list, that can be seen in animistic cultures that long predate even writing. These archaic religions oftentimes worship the gods of grain. The most famous example of this, and it's the example that Eliade uses in his book, are the religious populations of New Guinea. Their religious belief in particular revolves around the death and dismemberment of a maiden. And once her body is planted in the earth, it will regrow as various plants. This established the belief in this culture, and it can be seen in tons of other cultures, that to eat plants, certain plants from the earth, was to eat the flesh of gods. Eliade specifically emphasizes how this ritual, similar to the Eucharist, displays the belief that from sacrifice, creative potential can emerge. Not only are certain theological doctrine present in mythology long before the biblical narrative, but entire stories, locations, characters, and events are present as well. For example, the book of Job was one of the oldest books in the Bible, and it confronts this concept of why do bad things happen to good people. It is an in-depth exploration of divine judgment, the nature of divine judgment. Many scholars have pointed out the similarities between Job and the dialogues of misery, as recorded by the Akkadians nearly 1100 years before the book of Job. This would also fit with the known influence of Babylonian culture on early Hebrew scribes, and it seems that this influence actually bled into other concepts like the Garden of Eden. Lush gardens have long been a common way to represent a primordial paradise. Similar to the Garden of Eden, Sumerian literature speaks of the Garden of the Gods. Both are peaceful locations filled with wildlife that are protected and are centered around some type of important tree. In both areas, to be inside of the garden is to in some sense be eternal or be gifted eternal life. And in both narratives, eventually humanity loses access to the Garden of Eden, and that comes at some type of cost. The final large similarity that I want to mention only briefly, because I will be making a video on it specifically, is the flood narrative. There are so many different similarities between the Sumerian flood narrative and the biblical one. So much so that I think it warrants a video dedicated only to it. Lastly, I want to emphasize that these similarities in doctrine, location, events, and characters don't have to be due to plagiarism in all cases. As I mentioned before, I think the biblical authors were inspired just by the cultural beliefs that existed at their time. I think in some cases, such as the story of Noah's Ark, there's some direct plagiarism occurring, but in many of these other cases, it's just the natural development and evolution of religious ideas. This brings us back to an important question. Why is this discussion important in the first place? Christians obviously value the sanctity and divine nature of their texts. For it to be heavily influenced and in some cases a direct copy of surrounding cultures' mythological beliefs is devaluing in some way. I think what it does, and I think what Christians are afraid of, is that it brings Christianity into this larger global context, which reflect the impact of psychological, cultural, and political elements in how they can influence the development of religious beliefs. But I want to emphasize that this doesn't have to be a bad thing. Christianity is unique in how it brings together these concepts. Although they are echoed in older traditions, it brings them together in a unique way. And in some cases, Christianity even affords a commentary that contradicts these other religious traditions. So I will say this again, Christianity is undoubtedly unique, but it is not more unique than other religions. It's not unique in a unique way as many claim. I firmly believe that the religious impulse of humanity has some type of biological origin. I like to use the analogy of language. There is a biological, neurological basis for the development of language. But languages evolve and change all the time. There's thousands of languages that exist today, and nobody's arguing that their language is better than anybody else's language. I wish that we thought this exact same way about religious beliefs, that they're all relevant when trying to understand what religion is. The most fascinating element of the Christian tradition, in my view, is that it reflects human psychological experience and how different it is from us today. And I think this includes the very desire to have a unique God. The Israelites began not with monotheism, but monolatry. They believed that other gods did in fact exist, but that only Yahweh was worthy of worship. This speaks to an acceptance of multiple paths to truth, and simultaneously speaks to a humility in the face of mystery. Psychologically, again, to me, this reflects a more relational, less ego-based experience of reality, where being correct or objective or in some way superior in your position in regards to other people is not the most important thing. We know that throughout evolutionary history, all organisms have this tendency to increase the size and density of their cerebral cortex, specifically the frontal lobe. And this lobe houses important structures that mediate cause and effect reasoning. This year I've been working on my master's thesis, and I explored the differences in hemisphere function in response to stroke damage and how that influenced perception of psychotic symptoms. The most striking discovery was that when the left hemisphere becomes functionally dominant, this would be in the context of right hemisphere damage, it will utilize its logical abilities to construct a coherent narrative between the psychotic symptoms, including hallucinations and delusions. And this is not observed in the reverse. In other words, in our current time, the left hemisphere values internal consistency over objective reality. I think this relationship is ultimately reflected in religious ideology and their development. In this case, it emanates in the desire to formulate one perfect, overarching, consistent narrative that explains the existence of everything. I think this is the general trend of a lot of different theories that emerge. And the last thing I want to mention in this video is just to encourage everybody to look into other religious traditions. And you'll start to see how they all blend together coherently as one field. I would even go as far to say that Christianity, its development, could have been predicted previously. Many people have actually attempted to predict the evolution of new religious traditions from today's perspective. If you're interested in that, check out this video here.